He never thought music could sound like heartbreak. Yet in that quiet Parisian concert hall, as the first notes of Comte de Montepré floated through the air, his chest ached as if the melody had been written for his own sorrow. The chandeliers glowed above, golden light spilling over velvet seats, but the world around him felt dim. Every measure of the sonata unraveled memories he had tried so hard to bury, the laughter of late nights in tiny cafes, the warmth of a hand that once held his, the dream of a love that dared to cross the lines of wealth and pride. He sat frozen, unable to look away from the stage, even though it was only a nameless pianist pressing ivory keys. What he truly saw were fragments of another life, the life he lost when he let fear and family dictate what love was allowed to survive. The music swelled, tender and relentless, carrying him back to the boy he had left behind. And with each rising note, a truth grew clearer: no inheritance, no mansion, no expectation weighed heavier than the absence of that boy's smile. By the final chord, his decision was no longer a choice but a calling. He would leave it all, the glitter, the fortune, the cage of his name, and search for the one who had once been his whole world. Somewhere beyond the noise of Paris, beyond judgment, perhaps love was still waiting. Part 1: The Distance Between Hearts. Love had entered his life the way spring sunlight slips through the old streets of Paris, quietly at first, then so bright it was impossible to ignore. He was born into a world of gates, mansions, and expectations, a family name that echoed in the circles of wealth. To them, every gesture was meant to preserve tradition, every choice a performance of dignity. But within him, there was always a silence, a longing that no banquet or inheritance could ever fill. It was in that silence that he found the boy. Not among chandeliers or gilded corridors, but in a modest cafe where the scent of roasted coffee clung to wooden walls. There was nothing extraordinary about the place, yet it became extraordinary because of him. A pair of gentle eyes, hands that carried trays with quiet grace, a smile that seemed to know nothing of power or fortune, this was the beginning of everything. Their worlds should never have touched, yet they did. And when they did, it felt like fate had momentarily forgotten its rules. The afternoons became moments of stolen glances, the evenings turned into secret walks through lamplit streets. He discovered that happiness was not the applause of high society, but the sound of rain against a shared umbrella, or the warmth of leaning shoulder to shoulder while watching the city lights blur in the river. But happiness, for people like him, was always borrowed. The truth came swiftly, as truths always do. His family, with voices sharp as cold glass, reminded him of his place. Love, they said, was not for choosing. It was for arranging, for binding fortunes together, for maintaining legacies. A life of velvet and crystal demanded sacrifice, and the first sacrifice was always the heart. The boy became a secret, then a wound. Every message unanswered, every meeting avoided, was a blade he held against himself. He told himself it was protection, that to walk away was to shield them both from ruin. But in the silence of his room, surrounded by portraits of ancestors who had lived for nothing but their own wealth, he felt the weight of cowardice. Meanwhile, the boy he left behind returned to his quiet struggles. Life for him was measured not by the ticking of clocks in marble halls, but by the hours spent working, studying, surviving. The absence was a shadow, heavy and unspoken. Yet he endured it the way he endured everything, without complaint, carrying the memory of love like a fragile ember hidden in his chest. Seasons shifted. Paris bloomed and withered, lights rose and dimmed, but neither of them forgot. One clung to memory as a comfort, the other as a punishment. And still, they remained apart, separated not by distance but by a wall built from pride, fear, and the cruelty of circumstance. In the city's endless rhythm, he drifted like a man half alive. Wealth pressed upon him, but it felt hollow. Crowded halls full of strangers, dinners polished into perfection, conversations about politics and business, everything blurred together into an echo without meaning. Each night ended the same way, with silence that no luxury could soften. Love was gone, but it had not vanished. It lingered in traces, the memory of a laugh in narrow streets, the ghost of a hand against his own, the scent of coffee that sometimes returned when the wind shifted. It was everywhere and nowhere, a presence he could not forget, no matter how tightly he tried to lock it away. The city carried on, unaware of his grief. Lovers strolled along the Seine, children chased pigeons in the squares, and tourists pointed cameras toward the timeless towers of cathedrals. Life was vibrant all around him, yet he lived in grayscale, as though some essential color had drained away with the boy he lost. And then, one evening, he wandered into a world that was not his own but felt like a lifeline. A concert hall, quiet and golden, its air thick with anticipation. He came not out of passion for music, but out of desperation for silence, for an hour where his thoughts would not suffocate him. He sat among strangers in velvet seats, chandeliers gleaming above, and waited for the music to begin. The first notes fell like rain in spring, soft, patient, unassuming. Then the melody began to grow, unfolding into something hauntingly familiar. The program had named it Conte de Montepré, a composition whispered to have been inspired by lost love. He did not know its story, but the music carried his own. Every phrase was a mirror. Each rising swell pressed against the walls of his memory until they cracked open. The café, the laughter, the warmth of evenings long gone, they surged back with the force of the music. And with them came the ache, sharp and unrelenting, as though his chest itself had been tuned to the same key. In that moment, time no longer belonged to chandeliers or velvet or family legacies. Time belonged to the truth he had abandoned. The melody stripped away the armor of privilege and left him bare, a man who had chosen obedience over love, and was now nothing more than a ghost haunting his own life. By the time the final chord rang out, his decision had already been made, though he had not yet named it. His hands trembled, not from the applause that followed, but from the certainty blooming inside him. He could no longer pretend. No mansion, no inheritance, no ancestral pride would ever weigh more than the absence of the one person who had once made his world whole. Outside, Paris glowed with its usual beauty, but for the first time, he looked at it differently. The streets no longer seemed like a cage, they seemed like a path. A path he would follow, no matter the cost, no matter the judgment. Somewhere, the boy still lived, carrying his own quiet sorrow. Somewhere, love was waiting, fragile but alive. And so, beneath the lights of the city, his heart began to move, not toward the life he had been given, but toward the love he had once chosen and was now ready to choose again. The silence that followed. The days after the concert did not return to normal. Something within him had shifted, as though the melody of Conte de Montepré had torn open a door he could no longer close. He carried the music in his chest, its notes repeating long after the final chord had faded, echoing against his ribs until it became unbearable. What had once been a routine of obligations now felt like ashes in his hands. Mornings arrived as they always had, with servants moving quietly through corridors, with breakfast laid out on silver trays, with newspapers folded at his place. Yet everything felt hollow. The clinking of porcelain seemed louder than it should, the flowers on the table seemed too bright, and the silence between walls stretched endlessly. He thought of how mornings had once been, not with crystal glasses, but with the simple comfort of a steaming cup of coffee served in chipped porcelain, the scent of bread drifting from a bakery down the street, and the warmth of someone smiling across a table far too small for luxury but large enough for love. It was in these contrasts that his heart began to fracture further. Wealth no longer felt like privilege, it felt like a weight pressing him into a life he had not chosen. The expectations, the endless ceremonies, the measured steps of his family's world, all of it blurred into noise compared to the memory of one boy who had asked for nothing but presence, for nothing but a heart unafraid to stay. Meanwhile, the one he had left lived in another rhythm entirely. Away from chandeliers and banquets, life was marked by survival. The days stretched long in lecture halls, in crowded cafes where he worked to afford the bare minimum, in small rented rooms where walls carried the sound of neighbors too close and streets too loud. His world had no velvet, but it had honesty, and it had struggle. Love had once softened the harshness, made even the darkest nights feel alive with promise. But when love was taken, he carried only silence, a silence that followed him through every step. Though they were apart, they shared a strange symmetry, two men in the same city, breathing the same air, but living in different worlds that refused to touch. The distance between them was not measured in streets or bridges but in fear, in expectation, in the cruel arithmetic of privilege against poverty. And yet, beneath everything, the ember of what they had lived still glowed, faint but unextinguished. Time moved forward without mercy. Seasons shifted again. The city dressed itself in new colors, autumn leaves burning gold against gray skies, winter winds biting through narrow alleys, spring rains washing the stones clean. Through it all, the boy endured with quiet resilience, while the man of wealth endured with quiet despair. Both carried their grief in silence, and silence became the language of their separation. But the music had changed everything. After the concert, he found himself restless, wandering through the city without destination. He walked past bridges they had once crossed together, cafes that had once been theirs, quiet streets where their laughter had once echoed. Each place seemed haunted, as if the past had been imprinted into the stones. The city itself conspired to remind him, pulling him back into memories that refused to fade. At night, in his grand room lined with books and portraits, he would close his eyes and hear the melody again. The sonata did not forgive, it did not soothe, it demanded. It asked him why he had chosen comfort over courage, why he had surrendered love for the illusion of honor. The questions burned until he could no longer rest, until every breath felt heavy with regret. He began to imagine what life could be if he stepped outside of the cage. Not a life of titles or possessions, but a life of mornings on a farm road where the air smelled of grass and earth, a life where music was not played for audiences but for each other, a life where silence no longer meant emptiness but peace. The vision grew clearer each day, filling him with both longing and fear. To chase it would mean tearing away everything he had been taught to protect. Yet to ignore it would mean to slowly dissolve into a man who had lived but never truly loved. The boy, too, carried visions. In his exhaustion he sometimes closed his eyes and saw what might have been, a small house by the countryside, shelves lined with books they had chosen together, evenings where laughter filled the air instead of loneliness. He told himself not to dream, that reality had already shown its cruelty. Yet the dream returned each time he allowed his heart to soften, whispering of a love too strong to be destroyed by wealth or absence. They did not know it yet, but their lives were already bending toward one another again. The music had been a spark, and once lit, it refused to die. He could not return to the emptiness of obedience, and the other could not entirely erase the warmth of what had been given to him. Across the city, their hearts moved in quiet circles, destined to cross once more. And so, the silence between them began to shift. It was no longer the silence of surrender but the silence of waiting, of something approaching, unseen but certain. Beneath the noise of Paris, beneath its traffic and chatter and endless pulse, love stirred again, ready to rise from the ashes. Part 3, The Path Back to Love. The decision, once it formed, carried its own momentum. He could not stay in the house that had become his prison. The grand windows, the endless corridors, the portraits of ancestors staring down with frozen pride, none of it belonged to him anymore. His heart had already left, and his body only followed. It began with small steps. He stopped attending the dinners, the gatherings where champagne glasses clinked and hollow laughter filled the air. He ignored the carefully arranged meetings, the promises of alliances, the whispered plans of marriages that were never about love. Each refusal carved another crack in the life expected of him, but he no longer cared. He had chosen. One morning, without fanfare, he left behind the house of his name. There were no announcements, no goodbyes. Only a quiet departure, a single figure stepping into the streets of Paris with nothing but determination. The air felt different that day, sharper and cleaner, as though the city itself had been waiting for him to awaken. The search was not easy. Paris was wide and merciless, its streets teeming with strangers and shadows. He wandered through neighborhoods he had once ignored, cafes too small for his former life, libraries where students lingered, parks where the weary found rest. He asked no one and yet looked for someone everywhere. Each corner held the possibility of recognition, each crowd the chance of a familiar face. He found traces instead of presence. A cafe where the boy had once worked no longer carried his scent, but the wooden tables still seemed to remember. A music shop, quiet and dim, still held the echo of a violin string, though the hands that played it were gone. The city whispered of him, but never yielded him. It was like chasing a shadow that dissolved each time he drew closer. Yet he continued. Days stretched into weeks, but he walked on, through rain that blurred the streets and sunlight that turned stone to gold. He carried only one truth, that love was worth the exhaustion, worth the uncertainty, worth the entire collapse of the world he had abandoned. Meanwhile, the boy lived unaware of the search, tucked away in a modest corner of the city where life was measured in small victories and quiet endurance. He had built a fragile rhythm to survive the absence, mornings spent studying, afternoons in part-time work, nights alone with silence. The wound of separation had not healed, but it had become part of him, a scar carried with quiet strength. The world had taught him not to expect miracles. Yet destiny often waits until hearts are most weary to weave its threads. One late afternoon, when the city glowed in the colors of fading light, their paths finally crossed. It was not dramatic, not the spectacle of a film or the noise of a festival. It was simply two figures, once whole together, now broken apart, finding themselves in the same quiet street. For a moment the air seemed to still, as though Paris itself held its breath. The recognition was immediate, carved deep in memory. Eyes that once spoke of tenderness met again, carrying the weight of years in silence. No words were needed, the heart filled the space where language would have failed. The meeting was not easy. Behind the reunion lay the shadow of betrayal, of choices made in fear, of nights endured alone. The boy's gaze carried pain, and the man's presence carried guilt. Yet beneath the heaviness was something stronger, the ember that had never died. The city could not erase it, time could not bury it, and silence could not suffocate it. They did not argue, they did not explain. Instead, the space between them slowly began to close. Each step nearer felt like unlearning the fear that had once driven them apart. Each breath carried the promise of a life that could still be reclaimed. When their hands finally touched again, the world seemed to dissolve. It was not the grand halls of Paris that defined them now, but the simple truth of skin against skin, the warmth of a connection that had survived exile. Love did not return with fire or thunder, it returned as it always had, with quiet persistence, with gentleness that felt stronger than any force. From that moment, the choice was sealed. The city had been both their meeting place and their cage, but it would not be their future. They dreamed together, though no words were spoken, of mornings far from crowded streets, of fields where silence was peace rather than punishment, of a small home where love could breathe freely. Leaving Paris was not an escape but a return, to themselves, to the essence of love untouched by wealth or judgment. The countryside called to them with its promise of stillness, of skies wide enough to hold their hopes, of soil ready to welcome their labor. It was not luxury, but it was freedom. And so, step by step, they turned their backs on the city that had given them both joy and sorrow. They carried little with them, for they needed little. Love itself was the only inheritance they claimed, the only fortune that could not be stripped away. As the train carried them out of Paris, the skyline receded, and the rhythm of wheels against tracks became their new music. Fields stretched wide, rivers glimmered, villages passed quietly by. Each mile put more distance between them and the weight of expectation. Each mile drew them closer to the life they had chosen. In the stillness of that journey, they found peace in simply existing side by side. No wealth, no legacy, no shadow of judgment could intrude. The world outside rushed on, but inside, in the space between two hearts, there was only calm. Love, fragile yet unbroken, had found its way back. And for the first time, they were not afraid. Part 4, A Gentle Forever. The countryside unfolded like a soft hymn, slow and tender, carrying them into a world untouched by the noise of Paris. Fields stretched wide beneath skies the color of pale blue silk, and the air smelled of earth after rain. Trains no longer roared, horns no longer pierced the evenings, and wealth no longer whispered commands. Instead, there was only the hum of bees, the rustle of wind through tall grass, and the steady rhythm of their own footsteps across quiet roads. Their new home was nothing like the mansions of marble and crystal. It was a modest farmhouse with weathered walls, a roof that sagged gently at the corners, and windows that opened toward open fields. To some, it might have looked ordinary, even fragile, but to them it was perfect. Each crack in the wood, each stone along the path, seemed to welcome them not as heirs or servants, but simply as souls seeking rest. Life settled into a rhythm that was both simple and profound. Mornings began not with silver trays but with the golden light of dawn spilling into their room, warming the sheets, touching their faces. The scent of bread drifted from a nearby village bakery, and sometimes they would walk down dusty roads to buy a loaf still warm from the oven. They carried it back together, hands brushing in the silence of morning, hearts calm with the knowledge that there was no one to judge them here. The land asked for their labor, and they gave it gladly. They tended to a small garden where green shoots pushed through soil, watered rows of flowers that bent toward the sun, and repaired the wooden fence that circled the fields. Their hands grew rougher, their clothes simpler, but each effort became a song of freedom. Every seed planted was a promise, every harvest a reminder that life, even when stripped of grandeur, could be abundant with love. Evenings brought quiet rituals. Sometimes they sat on the porch as the sky deepened into shades of pink and violet, watching birds trace their way home. Sometimes they lit a lamp and read by its glow, the silence filled with the turning of pages. And often, when the world had gone fully dark, music returned. A violin would rest against a shoulder, strings trembling with soft notes that drifted out into the night air. No audience waited, no applause followed, but the sound was enough. It filled the farmhouse with warmth, weaving through walls and windows until it felt like the whole countryside listened. The loneliness that had once haunted them was gone. In its place was peace, not the peace of still water but the peace of a river flowing steadily, certain of its course. Their days were small but sacred, the shared meal, the shared work, the shared silence. Nothing was grand, yet everything was complete. Sometimes, when the wind moved gently through the fields, he thought of the life he had abandoned, the marble halls, the chandeliers, the endless ceremonies. They seemed unreal now, like a dream too polished to belong to him. What had once been a prison of expectations was now only a shadow, fading more each day. He carried no regret for leaving it. Instead, he carried gratitude that love had led him here, to a life that was finally his own. The boy, too, carried his reflections. The years of struggle had marked him, but they had also shaped him into someone strong, someone who could cherish joy when it finally came. In this new home, he felt not the weight of survival but the lightness of living. The silence that had once been filled with loneliness was now filled with belonging. Every gesture, every shared glance, every breath taken beside another heart was proof that love had endured. Seasons turned. Summer burned golden across the fields, autumn scattered leaves in shades of fire, winter covered the earth with quiet snow, and spring brought blossoms like confetti across the hills. Through it all, they remained side by side. The farmhouse aged, the garden grew, the air shifted with each season, but their love only deepened, rooted in the soil of the life they had chosen. Their story no longer belonged to Paris, to wealth, or to judgment. It belonged to mornings of sunlight, to evenings of music, to fields that stretched beyond sight. It belonged to the choice they had made, the choice to walk away from fear and toward love. And so, in the quiet of the countryside, two souls once torn apart found their forever. Not in marble halls or glittering banquets, but in the simple rhythm of days lived together. A love that had been tested by silence and distance, by wealth and absence, had survived to become something greater than either of them had imagined. In the end, it was not grand gestures or perfect words that defined their story. It was the way they carried water to the garden together, the way they sat side by side beneath endless skies, the way they found peace in knowing they would never again face the world alone. Here, in a farmhouse that leaned gently into the wind, love finally rested. And in that rest, it bloomed, not as a fleeting season, but as a gentle forever.